Trump has just done the one thing Europe feared most. He turned tariffs into a blunt political weapon. This time it's not vague threats or offhand remarks. This time he announced real tariffs on European countries and made it clear they could rise sharply in the coming months, tied to a single condition. They stay in place until the United States succeeds in taking control of Greenland despite opposition. That moment matters, because it finally shattered the illusion that flattery, compromise, or trade deals could restrain him. Europe has realized something brutal. Any agreement with Trump only lasts until he wants something else. But forget Europe for a second, because the real question is this. What does this mean for ordinary Americans, and who actually pays for this move? The answer is simple. Americans don't gain anything immediately, but they pay for it almost instantly. Tariffs don't float above daily life. They don't stay on policy papers or press conferences. They sink straight into prices. Politicians like to say tariffs punish foreign countries. But at street level, at checkout counters, tariffs work like a hidden surcharge slapped onto everyday goods. Importers pay more, then pass it on to retailers. Retailers raise prices for consumers. And if they can't raise prices enough, they cut somewhere else. Fewer hours, fewer bonuses, fewer hires, lower quality. Either way, the cost lands on regular people. That's where the pessimism begins, because Americans are already stretched thin. After years of high prices, higher interest rates, and rising household debt, most families aren't in a position to absorb another shock. They're surviving, not building cushions. You can see it everywhere. Smaller grocery baskets, cheaper brands, fewer discretionary purchases, more reliance on credit cards. The U.S. has become an economy where millions live month to month, hoping the next bill doesn't tip them over. When tariffs appear, they don't just raise prices. They shrink confidence. They send one clear signal. Things can get more expensive at any moment. And the most dangerous part isn't the number itself. It's not 10%. It's not even 25%. It's expectation. Businesses don't wait until the higher tariff hits. They react immediately. Prices rise early. Contracts are rewritten. Risk premiums get added. Companies defend themselves in advance, and when enough companies do that at the same time, prices creep upward like a slow tide. Consumers don't need to read policy documents to feel it. They just notice that the same life costs more, week after week, without any explanation that makes sense. This is why Greenland stops being about Greenland almost instantly. It becomes a familiar American story. Power struggles at the top, bills sent to the bottom. Americans can tolerate pain when there's a clear plan, a defined goal, and a visible endpoint. What they can't tolerate is uncertainty, especially uncertainty tied to a president's personal ambitions. When the end date depends on whenever Trump gets what he wants, the future turns into a coin toss. And economies hate coin tosses. Businesses stop investing, hiring slows, expansion freezes. Workers start worrying about being the next cut. Official numbers may still look strong. Markets may still rally. But daily life tells a different story. Prices rise faster than wages. Debt grows faster than savings. And every new tariff fight deepens the sense that the system keeps demanding more from people who already feel squeezed. If Europe retaliates, and all signs suggest it will, this won't stop at a few product categories. It will spread through supply chains, investment decisions, and labor markets. In other words, what starts as a geopolitical standoff over Greenland risks ending as something painfully familiar inside the United States. Higher prices, heavier debt, stagnant pay, and a growing sense that ordinary Americans are paying for decisions they never chose. Trump's move didn't just irritate Europe. It forced a decision that European leaders have been delaying for years. Either accept that the U.S. can openly use economic pain to coerce political outcomes, or draw a line and risk a full-scale transatlantic confrontation. And the reason this moment feels different is because it's not a trade dispute about subsidies or regulatory standards. It's tariffs being used as leverage over sovereignty. That's why the tone in Europe shifted from frustration to something much colder. This isn't tough negotiation. This is coercion. And if it works once, it becomes a template. So Europe's response isn't really about Greenland alone. It's about preventing the precedent that any country can be bullied into territorial or political concessions by having its economy targeted. Because once you normalize that, no alliance means anything, no treaty means anything, and no small country is safe. That's why you saw a joint line forming across Europe, including voices that normally disagree on everything. Their message was basically, we stand with Denmark and Greenland, and tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations. That phrasing matters, because it signals they're no longer treating this as just another Trump tantrum they can manage with careful wording and private diplomacy. They're treating it as a strategic threat. And that change in framing is the first step toward escalation. Because once something is labeled coercion, the only credible response is counter-coercion. Europe has tools for that. And for the first time, they're talking like they're willing to use them against the United States. The most important one is the EU's anti-coercion instrument, the so-called bazooka. It was designed for situations where a foreign power uses trade and market access to force political outcomes. It was written with China in mind. But now the scenario it anticipated has arrived from Washington instead. And what makes that especially explosive is that once this mechanism is triggered, the response doesn't have to look like a mirror image tariff. It can hit in ways that hurt far more strategically. Restrictions on investment, limits on access to public procurement contracts, retaliatory measures that target the leverage points of the other side, even moves that complicate intellectual property protections and market entry. In other words, it's designed to make the coercion expensive, painful, and unpredictable. Europe is basically saying, if you want to play this game, we can play it too, and we can make it messy. That's a turning point, because markets can price in a tariff. Markets can't price in messy. Messy is what breaks confidence. Messy is what delays investment. Messy is what makes companies choose survival mode over growth, and survival mode is always bad for workers. At the same time, the European Parliament is signaling that any broader EU-US trade arrangement becomes politically impossible under this pressure, because ratifying a trade deal while being threatened with tariffs tied to a territorial demand would look like surrender. So the logic in Europe becomes freeze the deal, keep the leverage, and show Washington that intimidation has costs. And this is where the downward spiral starts to become real. Because once Europe moves from statements to actions, the U.S. response won't be restraint. It will be escalation, because Trump's whole political identity is built on projecting strength. If Europe pushes back and he backs down, it looks like weakness. So he has an incentive to double down, even if doubling down is economically stupid. That's the trap. When policy becomes identity, the cost no longer matters. And the result is a cycle where each side feels forced to respond not because it's optimal, but because it's politically necessary. Now add Greenland itself into the picture. Protests and public anger in Greenland and Denmark aren't just symbolic. They create pressure on European governments to stop treating this as just Trump being Trump. Because for Greenlanders, this isn't rhetoric. It's their future being discussed like property. And when public anger rises, politicians have less room to quietly compromise. That hardens positions. Harder positions make negotiations fail. Failed negotiations make tariffs stick. And tariffs sticking is exactly what spreads economic damage beyond the original target. This is how a geopolitical dispute becomes a household crisis. But the most dangerous part of Part 2 is what it signals to the rest of the world. If Europe, one of America's closest allies, can be tariffed into submission over a political demand, then every country learns the same lesson. U.S. agreements are conditional, temporary, and enforceable only until Washington changes its mind. That destroys the concept of reliable partnership. It pushes countries to build redundancy, to diversify away from U.S. dependence, to create alternative trade and security arrangements. And that doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, then suddenly. And when it happens, Americans feel it later in the form of weaker export markets, reduced global influence, and fewer high-quality jobs tied to international trade. So even if Trump thinks he's asserting dominance, the long-term effect is the opposite. It encourages the world to move on. Meanwhile, inside the U.S., none of this feels like strategy. It feels like constant turbulence. Businesses see retaliation risk and pull back. Investors see uncertainty and demand higher returns. Higher returns mean higher borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs choke small businesses and consumers. And while all of this unfolds, ordinary Americans are still stuck with the same reality from Part 1. Prices go up faster than wages. But now there's another layer: job insecurity. Because in a trade war, the first casualties are often the sectors that rely on exports, cross-border supply chains, or global investment flows. In other words, it starts as tariffs on Europe, and it ends as, why did my company freeze hiring? Why did my hours get cut? Why is everything more expensive and nothing feels stable? That's the spiral, and what makes it so dark is that it doesn't require a catastrophic headline. It only requires persistence. A slow, grinding conflict that never fully resolves, because resolution would require one side to admit it was wrong. And in this environment, admitting wrong is the one thing nobody is allowed to do. Here's the bleak part that most people miss. Even if this Greenland tariff episode ends tomorrow, the damage doesn't. Because the real outcome isn't just a temporary price spike or a temporary diplomatic fight. The real outcome is that America teaches the world, and teaches its own citizens, that policy can be switched on and off like a mood. And when an economy starts to feel like it's governed by mood swings, people stop planning. They stop trusting. They stop investing in the future. That's when a country gets poorer in a very specific way. Not overnight collapse, but slow institutional decay, where confidence drains out of daily life like a leak you can't find. Trump's defenders will say, this is strength, this is leverage, this is how you win. But what does winning look like at the household level? It looks like a family that used to save a little each month now saving nothing. It looks like a family that used to buy decent groceries now buying the cheapest calories they can find. It looks like a family that used to talk about moving to a better neighborhood now talking about how to survive the next rent increase. And it looks like young people postponing everything: marriage, kids, home ownership, not because they don't want it, but because they don't believe stability exists anymore. That's the invisible cost of perpetual economic warfare. It steals the future by making people too anxious to build one. And that anxiety compounds because tariffs don't hit a single sector in isolation. They ripple. A price increase in imported components becomes a price increase in finished products. A disruption in supply chains becomes delays, shortages, and higher logistics costs. Retaliation becomes lost export sales. Lost export sales become lower production. Lower production becomes layoffs. Even when layoffs don't happen, companies protect margins by cutting hours, freezing hiring, reducing benefits, and pushing workers harder for the same pay. And that's the version most Americans actually experience. Not a dramatic headline announcing recession, but a steady deterioration of working life where you feel you're running faster just to stay in place. Now put this into the context of modern American financial reality. A huge share of households are already balancing on debt. Credit cards, auto loans, student loans, buy now, pay later. The whole system is built on the idea that tomorrow will be manageable. But when people start believing tomorrow will be worse, they change behavior. They cut spending, not as a choice, but as fear. Fear-driven spending cuts can tip an economy into slowdown, even without a formal crisis. Because when enough people do it, businesses lose demand and respond by cutting costs, which creates more fear. That's the feedback loop. And when policymakers keep injecting volatility, they accelerate it. That's why this story is bigger than Greenland. Greenland is just the headline. The real story is a pattern, using trade policy as a pressure tool for unrelated goals. That pattern makes every industry in America ask the same question. What's next? What country is next? What product is next? What rule changes next? And when companies can't answer those questions, they stop taking risks. Risk-taking is where growth comes from. When risk-taking dies, productivity stalls. When productivity stalls, wages stall. And when wages stall while prices rise, you get the most corrosive form of decline. A society where people work hard and still feel poorer every year. That's when social trust collapses. And when social trust collapses, politics gets even nastier because politicians feed on anger and fear, which then produces more extreme decisions, which creates more volatility, which creates more anger. The machine feeds itself. Now add one more layer, the credibility of American leadership. The U.S. spent decades building a reputation, sometimes fairly, sometimes not, as the anchor of the global system. But coercion against allies, especially over sovereignty issues, erodes that anchor. Allies don't just get mad, they adapt. They diversify supply chains away from the U.S. They harden their own economic defenses. They build alternative partnerships. That doesn't happen instantly, but once it starts, it's hard to reverse. And the long-term effect on Americans is subtle but brutal. Fewer global opportunities, less market access, less influence over standards, fewer high-skill jobs tied to global networks. The irony is that a policy sold as America First can end up making America smaller, not bigger. Not because the country loses a war, but because it loses trust. And trust is the thing that makes systems efficient. When trust disappears, everything costs more. Contracts get heavier, compliance gets stricter. Risk premiums rise, borrowing costs rise, investment slows, and again the bill lands on ordinary people. At this point you might ask, what's the end point? The answer is uncomfortable. There may not be one. Because once tariffs become a political weapon, they're too useful to put down. They become the default response to everything. They become the shortcut for leaders who want to appear decisive without doing the slow, hard work of building competitiveness at home. But shortcuts always have a price. And in this case, the price is the same thing Americans have been losing for years: stability. The kind of stability that lets you imagine a better life and actually move toward it. Instead, you get a country where every few months there's a new fight, a new threat, a new round of uncertainty. And people adapt by shrinking their hopes. That's the true bleak ending. Not that America collapses, but that America normalizes decline. People stop expecting improvement. They stop believing in upward mobility. They stop thinking the system will reward effort. And once that mindset takes hold, it's incredibly hard to remove, because it becomes part of how a society sees itself. So, yes, this started with Greenland. But the story isn't about ice or territory. It's about what happens to a country when politics turns the economy into a battlefield, and ordinary citizens become the collateral damage. It's about prices that creep upward, jobs that feel less secure, and a future that looks less like a plan and more like a gamble. And the darkest part is that after a while, people don't even get shocked anymore. They just get tired. They just accept it. They look at the next headline, the next tariff threat, the next confrontation, and they don't ask, "How did we get here?" They ask a much sadder question. How much more is this going to cost me?